Jesus freak here. You've probably noticed that I try to avoid using any translation in my videos other than the King James. But that I'm not opposed to other versions. I just believe that the Bible and church ought to continue to be the KJV. Now, probably a lot can be said about what a church believes, how liberal or conservative they are by the choice of translation. This used to be a conservative translation. This is the 1978 edition of the NIV, New International Version. You see, this Bible's taken a bit of a beating. It's in pretty good shape. It's a rather paraphrastic translation, but it doesn't really know how paraphrastic it wants to be. Sometimes it's actually really literal. It was actually they said they wanted to have a version in modern contemporary English, and that, you know, there wasn't any real other motive. I'm not so sure about that. I suspect that there might have been a reaction to the Berkeley version in play, and possibly a reaction to the RSV, because it's actually a fairly conservative translation in its original form as it existed in 78. They tried to make updated versions under other names, and they found out, you know, you keep trying to come up with another Bible and no one's going to take it, so they decided to throw out the old New International and replace it with this one in 2011. In some respects, it's still a conservative translation, but it seems to have taken a lot of cues from the New Revised Standard Version, which is a very liberal translation. They've introduced gender-neutral language, sometimes in places where it does violence to the meaning. So, a lot of times, you know, NIV was used anywhere from about the middle of the main line to a little bit to the right. The new one, it's used in more liberal circles by comparison. This is a New King James. It's actually, surprisingly, it's a relatively rare verse-by-verse New King James. Now, this has this schizophrenic issue that the New International does, but slightly different. Where the New International Version couldn't decide whether it wanted to be paraphrastic or literal, the New King James couldn't decide whether it wanted to be simply an update to the language of the King James or a new translation from the same sources. That said, it's a decent crutch. A church that's using the King James, it's good to have a New King James to follow along with. You might understand a little more. The CSB is the Southern Baptist Convention's answer to the NIV. And the fact that, they wanted a translation that they had control over, as they own the publisher. And it's comparable to the NIV in most regards, except that it's not as schizophrenic. It's more consistently liberal in translation style. Although it is still a relatively conservative translation, as marked by examples like Isaiah 7:14. I only have that Bible because it's got some good apologetic stuff in it, the Fisher of Men Bible. I actually reviewed the Spanish version in one of my videos and got a reply from the guy behind it. This is the ESV. Actually, this is a special edition of the ESV where they've reinstated the verses that are usually omitted from translations, usually based on the critical text. But it's still overall critical text New Testament. So if you're looking for, a Textus Receptus based translation that looks like the ESV, you're not going to find it here. This seems to be mostly found in conservative Presbyterian circles. In fact, the tendency for its fans to be hardcore five-pointers has given it the nickname Elect Standard Version. It's a descendant of the RSV and indirectly of the King James, so it's in a similar vein. Now, these are both NASBs. The top one is the 95 revision, which updated to more recent manuscript evidence and got rid of the these and thous. But it is more or less in the same style. It's an extremely literal, but not quite to a fault translation. Although sometimes I think the New King James is actually more literal. Now, although these are mostly, conservative translations used predominantly in scholarly circles, my two uncles, who were United Methodist and absolutely Wesleyan in their theology, and were quite learned in their, a lot of Methodist preachers are very educated. But this is the translation they used. It's not a bad translation. The main fault that I have with the NASB has nothing to do with its style, but with its textual base, which is also an issue with the ESV, the CSB, and the NIV over there. And I could probably get into the whole issue. In fact, I think I have. The problem with the critical text and the mindset behind it. But the NASB tries to be pretty close to the King James in style. This one's verse by verse, the other one's a paragraph format. You find both of them probably about equal. Now, my main issue with modern translations when they're used in worship is they cause confusion. When one person's reading out of a KJV and another's reading out of an NASB and another has, heaven help us, a message, pretty much every verse is going to have someone's eyebrows shooting up. And that's the problem. I don't necessarily think that the need to have an ideal translation trumps what I consider the more pressing need. And that's to have a uniform translation in worship. I would say that having these other translations for private study or whatever is fine. But when you have multiple versions in one place, it's just going to lead to confusion. You know who they say is the author of confusion. But there's another reason why I usually use the King James. It's not just this issue, and it's not just the fact that I know it offends people to even acknowledge the existence of other translations. See, if we gave up the King James, we're giving up a lot of our culture. And suddenly, a lot of English expressions cease to make any sense anymore. Having the King James, and at the same time having the corpus of William Shakespeare, it helps us understand our own language. That's actually the real reason why I'm loath to give it up completely. I just thought I'd bring up this subject as much as I could, because there were some questions about it. Anyway, Jesus freak out.